These days, there's so much news, it can be hard to keep up with what it all means for you, your family, and your community. The Consider This podcast from NPR features our award-winning journalism. 6 days a week, we bring you a deep dive on a news story and provide the context and analysis that helps you make sense of the news. We get behind the headlines. We get to the truth. Listen to the Consider This podcast from NPR.
For decades, owning a home was considered a golden ticket to economic security. You bought in young and retired on the proceeds when you decided to downsize. That was the dream, anyway. The reality looks a lot different today.
Remember when $1 million seemed like a lot of money? Nowadays, depending on where you live, it might not be enough even to get you a starter home.
If you guys are out there in Washington saying, I can't believe it's so expensive, you're right.
How many homes are on the market? What do we have to choose from?
$2 million.
How does this math even make sense?
I'm Joshua McNichols. This is Booming, a podcast about the economic forces shaping our lives here in the Pacific Northwest. The median price of a single-family home in Seattle is around $1 million. The greater Seattle area is the third most expensive in the nation. That means many wannabe buyers are getting shut out of the market. So, why do prices keep going up? And what would it take to make the dream of owning a home in this city affordable again? We put those questions to a real estate economist. That's coming up.
Tear it down.
Tear it down?
If your sills was shut and your timbers was okay, I'd say go ahead, fix her up. If your timbers was shut and your sills was okay, again, I'd say go ahead and fix her up. But your sills are shut and your timbers are shut. So I say don't throw good money after bad. Tear it down. Good day.
Seattle is now one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. Prices go up and down, of course, but they mostly go up over the long term, especially here. Now, they're so high, they're out of reach for a lot of folks. And nationally, the percentage of first-time home buyers has plunged to all-time lows. Just a quarter of buyers are first-timers, the lowest since the 1980s. It made us wonder how anyone can get their foot in the door anymore. So we did an informal survey and asked our listeners if they'd bought a house in the last 5 years. And if they did, how did they pull it off? The results aren't scientific, but they are enlightening. About 1/4 were able to afford a house through family help or inheritance. Another quarter could swing it because they had a high-income job or money in the bank. And the biggest chunk were able to buy a house because they already owned one that they sold to cover a down payment, about 32% of people. The survey made it clear to us that first-time home buyers need a lot of money or a lot of help, and in the majority of cases, both. So, how did the housing market get here, and what can we do to change it? I talked to real estate economist Matthew Gardner about that. Gardner has taught real estate economics at the University of Washington and is the former chief economist for Windermere Real Estate. And he said what our local buyers told us holds true nationally as well.
That actually tracks pretty well, specifically if we're talking about first-time buyers. Nationally, 25% of first-time buyers use a gift or a loan from family or from friends. But what was interesting to me is that a record high, actually 7% of first-time buyers used an inheritance. So we're already starting to see that what is going to be a massive transfer of wealth between generations.
So what does a first-time home buyer look like today?
Older. I say older is in the most polite way. Historically speaking, if you think about first-time buyers, we've really been in that very late 20s into early to mid-30s. And that's the way we've seen it, quite frankly, for the past couple of decades. But it jumped to 38 years old in 2024. That is the oldest the median age of a first-time buyer has been nationally since records have been kept.
So, that's a lot older. What do you make of that?
Well, the very obvious reason is it is very expensive. So it's taking a lot longer for would-be home buyers to gather those savings to become get into a position which they can actually buy a house. So that is, I think, one of the most unique things we're seeing today is the cost is forcing people to take a step back a bit longer than they would normally expect to see. There's also some other reasons as well, which we might get into, and that's delaying new household formations.
So how and why have things changed this much for home buyers, especially in the Puget Sound region? Because we're seeing that trend here too.
There's a couple of reasons. The most obvious one here in the Puget Sound is topography. We have a lot of water, a lot of mountains, therefore only a finite amount of land. Beyond that, over the course of the last 100 years, it's been since the first comprehensive plan, first zoning plan was put into place in the city of Seattle. So we had zoning back 100 years ago, and what's happened? The entire area has been built out. So you can't add on supply to the degree you'd like to. We have urban growth boundaries, which basically define where you can and you cannot build. So kind of go back to your Econ 101 classes. You limit supply, but you have net new demand. What happens to the price of anything? It goes up. And it has been a problem for a very long time, in my opinion. But it really is, I think, I know it's the worst now that I've ever seen it. And I've been here for a bit more than 25 years.
I know in previous generations, when people couldn't afford the city, they moved to the suburbs. How has that pattern changed in and around the Puget Sound region?
And that's another interesting one for two reasons. One, if you think about it historically, and you're absolutely right, if people could afford to live in King County, which is where we all know that most of the jobs are, then they did. But if they couldn't afford that, they jumped in their car onto I-5, they went, and they headed north up into Snohomish County. Well, a few years ago, that became unaffordable. And so now what are they doing? They're jumping in their cars and they were going south into Pierce County, where we see about $100,000 delta between home prices in Snohomish versus Pierce County. Moreover, obviously, COVID and the pandemic has some fairly significant impacts as well with out-migration, that drive to buy. People saying, okay, well, if I don't have to come to the office as frequently or even not at all, they'll keep on going until they find somewhere that they can afford to buy. So that has had an impact. But I think a lot of people expected we would see more households going out to the Yakimas this world and across into Eastern Washington. That wasn't the case. But they certainly moved further away with the view that I've only got to come into the office a couple of days a week at some point in the future. I'll put up with a lousy commute if it's allowing me to buy my first home.
One other option for first-time home buyers used to be that they could buy something small. You might call that a starter home. Do starter homes even exist today?
No, quite frankly. And that, I think, is one of the bane of our region's builders' lives. They know that we have a veritable tsunami wave of demand for the next 20 years between the younger half of millennials and then Gen Z after that, who are going to be getting older, creating households and wanting to buy a home. But the trouble is they know there's demand there, but they cannot meet it. On the supply side, why? We've mentioned it earlier on, a lack of land. But of course, what's become very obvious is the fact that tariffs are already having an impact, and they are being passed through from the builder to the end user, as in the home buyer. And that just makes it housing even less affordable. Going back in time, people used to consider condominiums to be ultimately the direction that first-time buyers would go. Well, we're not building any more new condominiums. We won't be building, I don't believe, any substantial number for quite a while because they are very expensive to build. But over and above that, you've also got additional costs coming into play if you buy a condominium, between homeowners' fees and home insurance rates, which continue to skyrocket. That makes condominiums, which used to be a good alternative for a would-be first-time buyer to get their foot on the first rung of the housing ladder, that's happening less and less now. It's just becoming few and far between.
We used to call home ownership as the bedrock of the American dream. It's how we build wealth in this country, for better or for worse. Do you think it still deserves that status as being part of the American dream, or have things changed too much?
In general, I think it does. We think about America, nationally, On average, 65% of American households own their home and 35% rent. Home ownership is the way most households create wealth. Now, we are going to see a massive transfer of wealth between the baby boomers and then over time, Gen X, about $85 trillion, give or take. It's a good lot of money. But the point is we are creating more and more forced renters that would love to buy, that they are just having a heck of a time either saving up enough or being able to afford the mortgage payment. Mortgage rates doubled from their all-time low. I think there are still some would-be buyers sat there crossing their fingers, hoping for rates to drop back down to 3% again. Don't do that. It's not going to happen. We'll probably be seesawing either side of 6% as the long-term terminal rate for a mortgage. But I think that we have a younger generation that is astute, that do understand not just the benefits of owning a home because I can paint a wall if I want to, but they are seeing that long-term appreciation. That they understand the fact that they will be paying down that debt over time. So I think all in all, the American dream isn't dead, but what I would say it is simply this: it is just harder to come by. You know, here in Washington State, House Bill 1110 allows a developer to build some multifamily inside single-family zoned areas, depending on the population. So in more populated urbanized areas, you can build up to 6-unit buildings inside land zoned single-family. That was a plan and legislation put in place, which I supported, but it was never going to be a panacea. It was never going to solve all our problems. Why? Well, as we mentioned earlier on, we're basically built out already. So for that to make sense, you have to tear down existing single-family houses. Well, that's going to be one thing. It's going to be expensive to then rebuild them. I think it will help, but it's not going to solve our biggest problems. So the biggest issues that we have are that builders know we have a young, burgeoning population that is growing up. They are creating households, having families, yes, with fewer children, but they are. And I do believe that they want to buy a home to live in because of the benefits that it offers them. But the obstacles, I would suggest, today are as high as I have seen it in 30 years.
All eyes are on Texas as Republicans work to draw new congressional districts ahead of 2026.
But the battle for control of Congress runs through Southwest Washington, home to one of the most competitive districts in the country.
And that's where incumbent Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez has a new challenger. He's the Republican leader in the state Senate.
Meet John Braun, a moderate who could deliver the 3rd district to the GOP, this week on Sound Politics, wherever you get your podcasts.
You know, you just talked about one measure to try to increase the supply of housing, which is to allow more what we call sometimes middle housing or townhomes in places that used to be just single-family homes. But I want to drill down on one thing that you mentioned of when older homes are torn down to make way for new homes that hits on something I hear from listeners all the time. People tell me, okay, I understand generally the rules of supply and demand and how they work in the marketplace, but things are different in housing. This is what they tell me. They say, you know, I know this single-family home used to be worth this much, and it was torn down, and the houses, the townhomes that went up in their place are $800,000 when I know that house used to be worth $300,000. So you're telling me additional supply will help address this problem, but all I see is that the additional supply is increasing how expensive Seattle's housing is. What would you say to people who have that concern and that reaction?
I cannot disagree with it. Yes, in principle, what you're saying does make sense. So let's say you have to buy, you're buying one. Well, normally people buy more than that, but let's say 2 homes adjacent to each other. That is expensive, but quite frankly, it is the cost to construct. It's the permits, it's the fees. More than 25 cents of every dollar it costs to build a home are fees of some way, shape, or form. Then you look at materials. Well, we still are tariffing lumber coming in from Canada, copper, steel, aluminum. A lot of it is also tariffed. So it has to make financial sense. And yes, that could well be $800,000. So yeah, it's, I think without having government assistance in that respect, then it's going to be very hard to increase the supply of entry level housing. And that's what we're really missing. And unless we see some form of subsidy, I'm not sure what that would look like, that's what it's going to take, I would suggest, in order to allow the number of would-be buyers to actually enter the marketplace. I think there's one thing which we didn't touch on as well, and specifically as it comes to the legislation to build increased density, that missing middle housing. And it's this. I have certainly seen a lot of neighborhoods and people who currently own homes within these areas where this zoning is allowed, very unhappy about the potential for more housing to be added, which I thought was a bit surprising, certainly here in Western Washington, where we do tend to have somewhat of a liberal bent. But what it explained to me very quickly was this, and it allowed me to coin this phrase: liberalism ends at the driveway. As much as we like to think that we can accommodate, put shelter over everyone's head, the neighborhoods within our city, in fact, within our region, they tend to take a somewhat NIMBYistic mentality. And an acronym NIMBY, I'm sure you're all aware, not in my backyard. But I think it's actually got worse than that. So I came up with another acronym, actually BANANA. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. It is yet another obstacle that builders have to face. When all of a sudden you've got homeowners associations brandishing pitchforks to try and stop your development from going ahead. So I think that it's a lot of issues that need to be addressed in order to start creating the number of housing units that, quite frankly, we need today.
Okay, so we've been, painting kind of a gloomy outlook for young home buyers. So what can we do to change this?
Well, certainly, and you're absolutely right. It's very easy to look at the doom, gloom, and despondency of the marketplace. Now, what can we do? Well, we're not going to fill in Elliott Bay, so that's not going to happen. There is no political will, in my opinion, to expand our urban growth areas, to bring in land further out that you can build on. So that isn't a solution. But what's somewhat unique about our region is that we have the city of Seattle, obviously by far the largest, and then we have satellites around it. The major ones being Bellevue, well, it doesn't like being called a satellite, but still is to the east, and then you've got Everett to the north and Tacoma to the south. So what if we were to think about it slightly differently and say, well, where is there an area that we could, in essence, build another satellite city, one that has that land base, and therefore with the ability to build housing on it, and just do it again, but not within our traditional job centers? It's a theory. It could be very hard to put into place, obviously, but I just see very few other solutions that are viable. And we need to do something without a doubt, because as we look to attract businesses to move to our region, a couple of things that any company thinks about, and that is there a talented workforce that I can hire? We'll check that box. We are remarkably smart here. Well, the second thing is, how much do I have to pay people? The biggest component being cost of living, salaries. We know we've been lucky for more than a century between Boeing and Microsoft and Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. Well, unless we're going to rely on them continuing, we need to attract companies to come here, and finding shelter for those employees is going to be very important. So I think there's potential for people to look elsewhere, and where they can actually create a new city, rather than just look at and piecemeal the very limited amount of space that we currently have that are close to our current job centers.
I'm going to propose something to you, and that is that we are actually already building those new places, but they are kind of piecemeal, and they're around light rail stations. Like, for example, the Spring District, outside of Bellevue, is kind of a new city that's being built where there were basically Safeway distribution areas. Mount Lake Terrace is this place where a lot of growth is happening. There's a huge apartment development right around the light rail station there that feels like a new city that could become the center of something bigger.
And you are absolutely right. But I think a word you mentioned there needs to be reiterated, and that is apartment. Is this helping the ownership sector. And certainly do I believe we need to continue to see development around nodes of mass transit and light rail. Yes. And then I'll be honest with you, I think that when the station area overlays were first put into place, I don't think they were bold enough. I don't think that they were high enough from a density standpoint. I don't think that they were wide enough either. So I think that's actually, to a degree, is a missed opportunity. However, if we look at it for the better part, you are going to be adding on to apartment supply rather than the ownership sector of the marketplace.
Unless you focus almost entirely on, you can have rings of townhouses around those station areas that are, served by transit. I'm just thinking about this idea of a new city and how problematic it could be from a commuting standpoint,
Well, yeah, but what if you didn't have to commute? I mean, if you did that, and what I'm saying is you'd have to create somewhere, or look to create somewhere, which is not just residential. I'm not looking to create another massive housing estate where people will be living there but not working there. I'm not about actually having both. And yes, you can put townhomes, and then you can get greater density, maybe 24 homes per acre on a townhome site, as opposed to 4 or 6 on the current single-family zone site. Absolutely right. But that's small. I mean, maybe that's the way to go. Maybe we have to start small. But are we just going to be kicking that can down the road even further? Well, we've been doing that for decades.
Yeah. Interesting, bold idea. I'm still a little skeptical because I know we've always had this, many planners had this dream of a self-contained exurban city where people would live and work. And oftentimes we found in practice what actually happens is people work in different places than they live. And even if one member of a couple works in the neighborhood, the spouse might not. So you end up with an increased traffic with these, other satellites that aren't on major transit corridors. But
I agree with you completely. Again, this for me was just a what if we could thought. Is it hard? Yes, we've tried it before, and we know that. But we've got to make some bigger plans to accommodate that growth because we are continuing to grow. We had out-migration certainly through COVID. That's turned around now. We have significant in-migration from international households coming into King County, into the central Puget Sound. And migration patterns, we still see more and more people coming out of California. We're seeing increasingly people moving from the south of the country to the north. So we are in a situation whereby if people want to be here, as long as they do want to be here, we have to provide shelter for them.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Matthew.
No problem at all. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a lot of fun. We certainly covered a lot of ground.
That's it for Booming. Thanks so much for listening. If you have a question about the economy that you want us to answer, email us at booming@kuow.org or leave us a voicemail at 206-221-7158. Also, special thanks to those of you who are donating to the show. We couldn't do it without you. If you want to donate, go to kuow.org/booming. Thanks. Our producers are Lucy Suchek and Alec Cowan. Our editor is Carol Smith. I'm Joshua McNichols, and we'll see you next time.
Hey, I'm Ton Vin, host of Seattle Eats, a food podcast from the Seattle Times and KUOW. Did you know Washington State grows 98% of the frozen raspberries sold in the United States? In the latest episode of Seattle Eats, we sample food made with these raspberries and learn how it all happens. Listen to Seattle Eats on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.